Great. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Reverend Rica. Originally born in Berlin, Germany, Reverend Rica Kaufel moved to the U.S. for college when she was 20. After graduation, she decided to stay and work in the field of education and applied linguistics. Then she decided to become a minister. She did her internship at Orange Coast Unitarian Universalist Church, was ordained in January of 2021, and worked as a part-time minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Anaheim, of which she has fond memories. However, growing increasingly homesick during the pandemic, Reverend Rica decided to move back home to Berlin. There, she spent almost 2 years serving the German Unitarians, giving new impulses and trying her best at church planting. She is currently exploring new avenues to let her ministry shine in Germany, while still keeping close ties to Unitarian Universalism in the U.S. Everyone, please welcome Reverend Rica.
Almost 3 years ago, my daughter and I moved from the Southern California, where I had the great pleasure and honor to serve as your minister for a while, to move from there to Germany, my home country. However, we returned for a visit a year later in the summer of 2023, and I believe I visited you that summer, and that was also a great pleasure and a great honor. However, this visit wasn't necessarily for my own sake, but rather because my daughter Elise missed the country that is, after all, her home. In fact, I was a bit grumpy about it. My main reason for moving to Germany had been the wish to be closer to my aging parents. But if I'm completely honest, there had also been a feeling of disappointment maybe, or disillusionment, an underlying sense of alienation that became stronger and stronger and made me long for Germany, the country that is, after all, my home. When my daughter felt longing, I felt a whole range of more complicated feelings that I hadn't really worked through yet at all. Not exactly a good starting point for a summer vacation. So in a way, I was very glad that we didn't just visit our old stomping grounds in California, but also some new places. I, for one, took the train from the West Coast to the East Coast, 3,000 miles across the country. But before that, we visited Julie and Robert, very dear friends of ours in Arizona. It wasn't our first time in Arizona. We'd been there a few years earlier to admire the Grand Canyon, Sedona, and Monument Valley. This time, however, we went to Tucson, the city where Julie and Robert had recently moved. I teased that Tucson would probably not be able to hold up against the more famous sides of Arizona, and Julie and Robert were determined to prove us wrong and show us everything Tucson had to offer. Among other things, we visited the mission San Javier del Bac, one of the old Spanish missions so common in the Southwest. It stands in the middle of the desert, small perhaps compared to the Spanish cathedrals it seeks to imitate, but a large, unexpected structure amidst the barren landscape. Of course, having lived in California, I was already familiar with the Spanish missions. I had seen many, the beautiful wide buildings, the carefully carved figures and altars. And of course, the hardest construction work was not done by the Spanish, but by the indigenous tribes to be civilized by these very missions. I had always felt quite ambivalent that such a dark part of American colonization history could leave behind such beautiful remnants. For those who think that beauty is amoral, these missions could serve as a prime example. But the mission San Javier del Bac, this building in the middle of the desert, touched me. In the main chapel, the faces of the carved figures displayed such despair, such tense exhaustion, that I wondered if they perhaps reflected the faces of the unsuspecting Spaniards who had ended up here in the middle of the desert rather than the fertile grounds of California. In the background, a quiet but unexpected sound. Not organ music or Gregorian chants, but indigenous voices and melodies. For this mission, still used as a church, is located on the reservation of the Tohono O'odham, the very descendants of those who were forced to build the walls of this building. And so I stood there, silently. And my friend Julie joined me, just as silently. And then, after a moment, she said, "Oh, the beauty and the suffering. The beauty and the suffering." And in this short expression was everything that needed to be said about this country, America, where so much beauty can be found, and yet which is built on so much human suffering. The same applies to the spread of Christianity and maybe to the entire history of humanity of which we are a part. The beauty and the suffering. Two concepts that seem so contradictory, and yet we encounter them again and again, running like intertwined threads through our human interactions. So maybe it's not surprising that for a long time, beauty and suffering were not considered opposites, at least not in Western art. This becomes apparent as soon as you enter a Catholic church or a museum and you see the many artistic depictions of the martyred, suffering Jesus. And we see it in motives from other myths too. Just think of the many, many different versions that have been painted of the Roman myth of the rape of the Sabine women. This myth refers to the early history of Rome, when Romulus and his followers attacked the neighboring Sabines during a festival to abduct their young women. There are a surprisingly large number of painters that depicted this truly horrific story of betrayal, kidnapping, and sexual violence, of suffering, in an extremely aesthetic way. There are paintings by several artists, Rubens among them, but then also this statue by Jambola, which I want to show you here. It startles me how beautiful it is and how realistically it renders the horror, the violence at the same time. The contrast is so great that it often leaves me perplexed, with a queasy feeling in my stomach. Should suffering be depicted this beautifully? Doesn't the beauty cover up the suffering? And isn't that inherently problematic? This is precisely the question that modernist philosophers and artists asked themselves, and they answered it with a resounding no. While it was art's job to depict suffering, it wasn't art's job to portray suffering as beautiful. Art shouldn't be about beauty, but about truth and about ideas. Maybe art should even be political. In modernism, the concept of beauty is viewed as bourgeois, superficial, frivolous. Art, on the other hand, should go deeper. It should be a statement. And thus, Picasso's version of the rape of the Sabine women deviates from the traditional framework and presents the scene in a way that is definitely not beautiful, and maybe not something you would hang in your living room. Instead, it depicts the dehumanization that violence brings with it in all its horrible starkness. Less beauty, more suffering. And in a way, it makes me feel a little less queasy. And yet, even modern and postmodern art has not been able to alleviate suffering in the world. Suffering still exists. The concept of beauty has also persisted, even if considerations of what is beautiful might have changed. I realize that my presentation here is somewhat simplified. Entire books have been written about the concept of beauty and in art and in philosophy. And that's also not even the main point I want to make. Instead, what I want to talk about today is how we, as a religious community, position ourselves towards the suffering in the world, and what role beauty plays in this. We, as UUs, are deeply invested in values like justice, equity, and interdependence. And we are guided by love. This also means that the suffering of other people affects us, and that the suffering of the earth, of our environment, affects us as well, for we are part of this interconnected web. And becoming aware of this in everyday life means that we have to confront a great deal of suffering. For there is so much suffering in the world, so much suffering that we humans inflict on one another, so much suffering that we humans inflict on the world. So much suffering that we are interconnected with. And so much suffering that we are called to alleviate, guided by love, by working towards equity and justice. This presents us with a dilemma. I often find myself either seeing myself as part of the whole, meeting the suffering of others with true compassion and empathy, and this quickly becomes too much, more than I can bear, and I turn away before I fall into the kind of desperate paralysis that barely allows me to get through my day, let alone even begin to alleviate any suffering. Or I manage to work through the daily litany of suffering, but only if I keep it as a distance, if I close myself off, if I disconnect. Not my circus, not my monkeys. In both cases, I feel like I'm not living up to our UU calling or my own ideas of responsibility and humanity. And I also believe I'm not entirely alone in this feeling. I think many of us have felt this way at some point. So what can we do? How can we overcome this conflict? Perhaps beauty, the so often criticized, politicized, privileged beauty, will help us. Perhaps beauty doesn't hold our salvation, but it shows us the starting point for saving ourselves, not because beauty in itself has a moral or educational effect, nor because it's meant to beautify suffering, to conceal it, but because it helps us endure suffering without having to renounce it, and because it might even help us take action. In her work on beauty and being just, the philosopher Elaine Scarry says that it is in the face of beauty that we decenter ourselves. She says that it is our experience of beauty, and I quote, that lets the ground rotate beneath us several inches, so that when we land, we find we are standing in a different relation to the world than we were a moment before. It is not that we cease to stand at the center of the world, for we never stood there. It is that we cease to stand even at the center of our own world. We willingly cede our ground to the thing that stands before us. End quote. Perhaps it is precisely this process lifting us from our own center and placing something entirely different in its place, a beautiful summer meadow in the evening light, a work of art, or cheering, laughing children romping on the beach, building sandcastles and splashing water. Perhaps it is this exact process that makes us understand that we are part of a whole, not because it awakens in us the desire to participate in this beautiful world, but also because it makes the beautiful things we see a welcome part of our world, placing them at the center of our perception and thus beautifying our world and bringing us joy. The British environmental journalist Michael McCarthy makes a similar argument in his book, The Moss Snowstorm, of which we heard an excerpt earlier. Bitterly concerned about the ongoing destruction of the environment and the inaction of most people, he claims that it is not necessarily the image of environmental destruction that move people to action, for too often they are met with either disinterest or a deep despair that paralyzes us. Instead, he argues, we must rediscover the beauty of nature and the joy it brings us. This feeling of deep, unbridled joy and the fear of loss it contains is what could move us to prioritize the preservation of nature. Because true beauty doesn't say, admire me. True beauty says, delight in me, fall in love. And true beauty says, see me, protect me, preserve me, fight for me. But beauty does even more. Combined with our imagination, it gives us an idea of how things could be. And it invites us to follow this idea. Both in art and in our own imagination, beauty can give us a vision of a world that is different, better, more livable, more just, more beautiful. Beauty and our imagination can offer hope in the face of pain and destruction. And that is how it helps us overcome suffering. It shows us a better world and therefore gives us inspiration. And yet, can this process take place when we are confronted with human suffering? Because human suffering is not beautiful. Faces distorted by hatred, bodies broken by violence, eyes tired by hunger and despair. Mounds in the street covered by sheets that were living bodies just mere moments ago. Tired figures, filthy, almost faceless. What's beautiful about that? Does beauty turn away from those who suffer the most? But we all know how beautiful people are when they are well, when they are neither hungry nor afraid, when they are physically unharmed and surrounded by their loved ones. We all know how beautiful the face of a father is whose eyes soften when he holds his newborn child for the first time. The beautiful features of those peacefully napping, knowing that they're safe and their loved ones are safe, that they have time and leisure. The beauty of people laughing or singing together or dancing exuberantly. We know this because we have experienced this beauty ourselves. And we can apply this knowledge to build a new vision, a new imagination in the face of suffering. Instead of suffering people, we can imagine the same people as happy people, sitting at a long table, talking, laughing, passing steaming bowls to one another with open arms, with outstretched hands. And we can rejoice in this vision of humanity We can fall in love with it until we see ourselves sitting at the same table as part of this humanity, as part of this beauty, part of the whole. And if the pursuit of beauty has moved us to cause human suffering in the past, the opposite can also be true. The pursuit of beauty can inspire us to alleviate suffering until this imaginary table, which shows us the beauty of human community, becomes endless, until there's room for everyone. Each time we are confronted with new suffering, we can make more room in this vision. And maybe this way we can better endure suffering, not as something distant and unchangeable, but as something that we are connected to and as something that we must change to protect this vision of a better world that we have fallen in love with. Beauty can show us the way there. And so we change the world not because it is terrible, but because it could be more beautiful. Because we can make it more beautiful for others and for ourselves, for we are all interconnected. And perhaps beauty can not only help us alleviate the suffering of others, but also diminish our own, precisely because it makes our world rotate and place something else in its center. Because it makes us fall in love and thus softening us, opening our hearts. As I mentioned, when I returned to the US 2 summers ago, full of resentment, I took a train ride across the country. I spent hours by the window gazing at the changing landscapes. I saw deserts, prairies, and mountains. I drove past skyscrapers and through tiny, tiny towns. I saw wild nature and carefully cultivated fields, green meadows, lakes, and swamps. So much beauty that filled me, that became the center of my attention and thus slowly displaced the resentment, softened me. It didn't make me want to return to this country, but it reminded me why I first fell in love with it. And thus it eased my disappointment, my hurt, my suffering. Beauty can heal us too, at least a little. Maybe right now, at this point in time, some of you might also have ambivalent feelings about this country. Maybe you too need to remember what you loved about it. Maybe seeing its beauty amidst everything else can be your way to building a better America. And so here's my appeal to you. Focus your attention on what's beautiful in your world and in your country. Find beauty and let it inspire you in the face of suffering. Let yourself be filled with visions of a more beautiful place for everyone. And then put these visions into practice and make the world more beautiful. May it be so, and blessed be.